Dr. Sophia Yin said, in animal behavior, dominance is defined as a relationship between individuals that is established through force, aggression, and submission in order to establish priority access to all desired resources. A relationship is not established until one animal consistently defers to another.
I could be a mess, stressed in yesterday. He don't care less, he sees me anyway. Yeah, he sees me anyway. My dog thinks I'm great, he thinks I'm number one. He never hates, even when I'm done.
So this episode is brought to you by Simple Solutions to Common Problems, a dog training guide. This is my second book. It covers the problem behaviors that I'm most often asked about in classes. So jumping up, chewing, biting. I will put a link in the description if you're interested, and I hope you'll check it out and find it informative. So one of my things, I love studying development, and in this instance, evolution of dogs and the behavior, so much so I've talked about I went back to school, got my psychology degree. This is part of the manifestation of loving this topic so much. It's an oversimplification that psychology is more about development, how everybody develops and the things that they're going through as they hit certain stages in their life, whereas psychiatry, for example, would be more about how the individual is thinking. And again, that's a gross oversimplification, but just to kind of give you an idea of where my interests lie. For a long time, it was my theory that dogs and wolves co-evolved. There's a lot of reasons for this, and it had to do with scientific research and mitochondrial DNA and things like that. There was a lot of evidence to support it, but there was a study that came out a few years ago, and we found out that dogs did evolve from wolves, and wolves also evolved from that same ancestor. And it's not wolves like we think of today. It was one of the previous incantations, I guess, of that evolutionary step towards the wolves that we have today and dogs. It's difficult to pinpoint when the first dog evolved, and I think one of the problems with that is scientists are always looking for, that first dog. And because the situation was set up during the Pleistocene period for dogs and humans, or canids and humans, to interact, I think there were multiple occurrences around the world. One of the earliest dogs that we know of from archaeological evidence was from northern Spain, dates back to about 20,000 years ago. But because evolutionarily they are so close to each other, there are a lot of similarities between wolves and dogs. When we talk about dogs being very patomorphic in relation to wolves, and patomorphic just means they retain some of the childlike characteristics. So the shorter muzzles, they play throughout their lives, whereas wolves generally stop after puppyhood. So they may have bred over time. We're going to circle back to this in just a second. So during the Pleistocene period, humans were hunter-gatherers. They were just wandering around looking for food, and it is likely that the wolves of that time were following the same herds, and so there would be some interaction, probably not breeding so much or caretaking, raising the dogs. But one of the problems with that time period is because they were moving around, the archaeological evidence is really contained. So they may, I will say, they camped in a place for the night. It's just a really small trash pile, maybe a few artifacts that got broken and were left behind or whatever. Whereas once they got to the Neolithic era and they started creating villages, there's a lot more archaeological evidence around a smaller, or a small area. So it's a lot easier to find this stuff. So looking at the hunter-gatherers, it's a lot harder to find information about that time and how they were interacting with the canids of that time. Once we get to the Neolithic period, people had a bit more time. A lot of their time was spent just surviving. So I'm not going to say they, could breed like in the Victorian era where there was a boom in dog breeding, but they had a little more time to devote to that, even if it was just sitting and waiting for the dog to approach them, giving them that time to do that. So one of the things we think is that as these villages were created and they had their trash piles, the dogs would come up to it. Another person comes out to bring their trash. Some of them are going to run away and not come back or avoid these humans. The others that have the shorter flight distance, those canids are going to be in proximity to each other. They're going to be close to each other, and because of that, they're probably going to breed. The ones that were aggressive, and we're going to talk about dominance here in a minute, but those canids would have been killed. The people of that era, we don't think they had the time to mess with counter conditioning and that type of thing. They would have killed them, eaten them, used their fur for clothes, and just been done with it. One of the things that I find really interesting when we start talking about domestication is the research done in Russia by Dmitry Belayov, who is working with foxes. What we've learned is as genes are changed for behaviors or a certain look, it could have an effect on the genes that are adjacent to that. So there are some other changes over time, or there's a possibility of changes. So Belayov was trying to breed a much calmer fox. That's the only thing that he was breeding for. The affiliation and a social ability. The researcher would walk up to the cage, put their hand by it. If the fox approached, that was what they were looking for. If the fox withdrew, then they didn't use that one in this experiment. And they did the same thing with aggressive foxes, but we won't get into that. What they found is over time, as they were breeding just for that calmness, just for that gregariousness, we'll say, the foxes, some of them started getting floppy ears. Some of them started getting curly tails. Some of them started getting a piebald coat. Some of them started getting shorter muzzles. They would go into estrus twice a year instead of once a year. A lot of these things that we see that distinguish a dog from a wolf, we're seeing in these foxes that he was breeding compared to the ones that had not been selected for this research. So over time, because these dogs were in proximity to each other and they were interbreeding, we started to see probably some of these traits that we see in what we call a village dog, where it's the tannish coat and the curly tail, and they're about, I think, 22 inches tall. They go into estrus twice a year. Getting to the whole dominance myth, the problem with that is pop culture has tried to define this in really simplistic terms, and it's caused a lot of problems, particularly for trainers, and for the dogs. Because, you've got to dominate your dog. If they go through the door first, they're being dominant. No, they're just better at locomotion, can get there faster. If the dog's on the couch, he's trying to dominate you. No, he's on the couch because it's comfortable. Going back to that quote from Sophia Yen, a relationship is not established until one animal consistently defers to another. What that means is we may have one dog that wants a particular resource, a tennis ball. The other dog doesn't care about it. They have deferred to the dog that wants the tennis ball, and so that relationship, that dominant relationship, has been established by the deferring to the other dog. It's not the one being more aggressive and wanting it more. L. David Meach wrote a book called The Wolf, the Ethology and Behavior of an Endangered Species, where he coined the phrase, or is credited with coining the phrase, alpha wolf. The problem with that is almost immediately he came out and said, this research is flawed. We need to disregard it. Here's what's really happening. One of the problems with the research was they were looking at wolves that were in captivity, and he made the comment that by observing wolves in captivity, it's like learning about families by observing people in a concentration camp. You just can't get a realistic view of how all of that plays out. So the actual structure of the wolf pack, it's a family unit. So you have the mother and the father who are kind of setting the rules, and then you have all of their offspring. And I find it really funny, a lot of people say, the lone wolf, I'm so cool, and I'm a lone wolf, I'm out there by myself and making it on my own. What's actually happening with those lone wolves is once the males reach sexual maturity, and some of the females, they will go off and find their own pack or form their own packs, and become the parents of that pack, of that family unit. It's also got to the point where wolf researchers, instead of calling them the alpha male, alpha female, they'll call them the mating pair, the mating male and the mating female, because it is that family unit. There's no fight for dominance. If one of the pack or one of the family is injured, they are not going to hunt as effectively, and the whole pack is going to suffer because of that. So it makes no sense for them to constantly be fighting each other for dominance, for hierarchy. Now, getting to dogs, what we see is, one, dogs are scavengers, so they will form loose transitory affiliations, or basically that means they'll come together for a little bit and then they kind of go their separate ways. Even to the point that males, once they have, let's say, inseminated a female, they're gone. They don't hang out and help raise the young. And even the female, once she has the puppies and they are weaned, she's pretty much out of there. That's the end of her duties, and the dogs are left to their own to go and scavenge. So the only time you really see dogs come together as a group is if a food resource or resources are really small or really low. So I don't know, we'll say the village has a cleanup project and they get rid of all their trash and everything, and there's only one small pile. Of course, all the dogs are going to come to that area. And then the other reason would be when the females are in estrus, they're going to come and try and find a mate, so they'll be around each other. And so there's no cause or no reason for dominance in wolves or dogs. The scientific definition of dominance is priority access to a resource. Dr. Meach again said that dominance is not a personality trait but an aspect of a relationship. So that goes back to what Dr. Yen said, and one dog or one animal deferring to another. So a good example I like to use, a lot of people can relate to, say my wife and I would go out for pizza and beer. I love beer. It's one of my favorite things. I love having a good beer. My wife loves pizza. She could eat it every meal and just be happy with that. In this scenario, if there's one beer, one pizza left, my wife is probably going to get the pizza not because she wants it more, but because I want it less. I'm going to let her have that, thereby making her dominant in the relationship. The beer, on the other hand, my wife doesn't like beer. She's allergic to alcohol. Like I said, it's one of my favorite things. So she is going to defer to me. She is going to make me dominant in that context, in that relationship. Another good example, Puck and Duncan, a couple of dogs that we had a while back. I've mentioned Duncan loved tennis balls. It was his crack, his favorite thing in the whole world. Puck was a terrier. He didn't care. So if there was a tennis ball around, Duncan was going to get that. Puck might not even look at it, much less try and get it from him. The other side of that is Puck, being a terrier, he loves small, furry, fast-moving things, so we would have tug toys around, and he would go nuts for them. Duncan would play with him every once in a while with that tug toy, but he never went and got it and played with it. Puck was always the one that got it, and he would chew on it and play with it and come and ask us to play tug with him. Duncan was making Puck dominant in that situation. So it has nothing to do with a personality trait. It's just a desire for that resource. And while we're talking about this, I'm going to do another episode. I'm putting together the research and outlining it, but just a quick mention about resource guarding. It's not a dominance thing. Aggression is fear of losing comfort or safety. So the couch that I mentioned before, that's comfortable. The dog likes being there. It has your smells on it. The food aggression. Malcolm, for example, the dog I have right now, he was a street dog for probably the first year and a half or so before we got him, before he went into the system of foster homes and dog rescues. And he's not a resource guarder, but it could manifest that way with some dogs. If they've always had trouble getting food, they're going to guard that resource because they're afraid of losing it. They need food to survive. But like I said, we're going to talk about that in another episode. I'm still working on putting it together. It'll be a couple of weeks, hopefully. How all this relates to training and my training, and I talk about this the very first night just to kind of get it out of the way, not this in depth, but when we talk about our dogs and dominance, we can't know what they're thinking. We can't know their motivation. We just have to look at the antecedent, or what comes before the behavior itself, and the consequence, and then modify one of those three things to get the behavior we want. So it doesn't and shouldn't play into our training at all. There's just no reason for it. If you have questions about this, like I said, it's one of my favorite topics. I've read a lot of research about it. I've got a lot of references and that type of thing. Get in touch with me in the comments, and I will bore you to tears, I promise. If you would, you can follow this channel, and we will see you next time.